a story that was told to me 20 years ago that stays with me still. It was a very simple story. It was about by a man who worked for General Electric. He lived in Schenectady, New York, and he worked in Saratoga, New York. And he said, every day for 20 years, I drove to work on the same road and returned home on that same road that night. And he said, after 20 years, I could tell you the color of every house, what it said on every sign, every inch of that road I had long ago memorized. He said, and then something interesting happened. My car broke down. And so I took it in to be fixed. They gave me a loaner, but instead of giving me a car, they gave me a van as a loaner. Now that very inconsequential thing had an interesting impact. He said, as I drove to work the next morning, I was sitting 12 to 18 inches higher than I would normally sit. And he said it was like a miracle. I was seeing over fences I hadn't seen over in 20 years. I was seeing various items that I didn't know existed that were a part of that tapestry that I thought I knew so well. He said it revolutionized my thinking about this road I was always on. Now, that's a very simple story. But to me, it's a very powerful story because it says so much about what surrounds us. One of the themes, one of several themes in the work on positive organizational scholarship is the discovery of resources that already exist, that are available to us. We just don't know it. And it makes the effort very, very powerful, I think, as we study various topics. We are dedicating, as I said, for the next 9 sessions, our attention to the notion of generative practices in troubled times. Generative means to originate or to produce. The question is, how do you originate or produce when times are bad? What normally happens to you and I as individuals and to organizations when times turn bad is we close up. We become cut off from the resources that surround us. Yet in psychology, we learn from post-traumatic growth research that in very troubled times, people can, as a result of that, have enormous growth and become very aware of new resources. In organization studies, we learn that in times of crisis, we see some of the most dramatic changes in organizational cultures, and hence it's a moment of great opportunity. And so the basic message is that in troubled times, or in contexts of decay, we may find the seed beds of the positive and of potential. So we'll explore that from many angles this year. The first person that will do that with us is Kim Cameron, and I'll introduce him in just one second. But I do have one announcement. Where's Janet? Janet, would you tell them a little bit about this? Thank you, Janet. In terms of introducing Kim, Kim and I have been linked for a long time since we were undergraduates, and we've spent pretty much our professional and some of our personal life together for a long time. And he's someone I greatly admire. I'd like to make just a couple of points about Kim today. One is a little story. He left us about 10 or 15 years ago for a few years. And when he left, the department met and said, well, who should we hire to replace Kim Cameron? And they said, well, let's make a list of what he's done. Well, they started on this end of the whiteboard, and it just kept going until people were pretty much stunned by the time the list was done. And they said, you know, to hire, this is the workload of 3 people. And it was a pretty amazing thing to see. Kim's an incredibly energetic person who gets involved in so many things that it fills up a whiteboard. But in the meantime, at that point, he had had major impact on 2 entirely separate fields. One was management. The other was higher education. His work has just been extensive in both those areas. Now, he's making still another major contribution. He's one of the central spark plugs in positive organizational scholarship. This summer, he's editing a new handbook, just finishing up with Gretchen Spreitzer, editing the Handbook of Positive Organization Scholarship, which has 60-plus chapters. I told him that if I had that task, it wouldn't have only taken this summer, but it would take me 5 years, and I'd still be struggling. And he and Gretchen have just flown through that very, very onerous task. It will be one of the many major contributions he's already made to help shape this brand new field for which he's being recognized internationally. So it's my pleasure to introduce one of the finest human beings I know, and someone you will enjoy very much, Professor Kim Cameron.
It's being like that's like being introduced by your mother. I mean, I've known Bob Quinn since we were 21, and we like each other a lot. So you can't believe hardly anything about what he tells you. I'm really honored to be invited to give this presentation, and especially honored that you'd come to talk about what positive organization scholarship is all about. I have changed. I completely revised this presentation Saturday. So as soon as I found out that we were all going to be together, because some of you know POS intimately and some of you not very much. So I'm going to share some things that some of you have heard before and some I think that you haven't. But I want to review a little bit about POS. But the theme about troubled times starts with some information that I have gathered as I've been spending. In fact, last week, Bob and I, last week and the week before, spent all day, every day with people who are leaders of the national intelligence agencies in America. So that's the CIA, the FBI, counterintelligence, cybersecurity, people who wake up every morning making sure that somebody doesn't blow themselves up in a shopping mall. I mean, I actually sat and talked to a person Thursday night saying, you know, I'm actually quite surprised that somebody hasn't walked into the Briarwood Mall and some mall in Omaha and some mall in Poughkeepsie and some mall in Miami and blown themselves up simultaneously, which would create chaos in our country. How come? And they have answers to that. I mean, there's somebody consciously keeping us safe every day. So, pretty interesting group to spend time on. POS happens to be a very core concept for them. Well, here's one of the reasons why. So 20%, by the year 2020, 10% of the world's population will not have access to water. Now that's not potable water, clean water, that's water. And by the year 2050, 1/3 of the population of the world will not have access to water. So you think about that. If your children are starving to death, all bets are off about how civil we'll be, right? So the assumption is it's going to get worse in that sense. 77% of all the wars fought on the planet are currently fought in areas where there aren't enough resources to keep people alive. So that creates conflict, unrest. You know, the rules of civility are postponed when you don't have enough resources to keep yourself alive. 65%, 2/3 or so of the world's population lives in cities. That's increasing rather than decreasing. So the assumption is that the conflict and problems in the world will not occur, you know, that side of the river versus that side of the river. It will be downtown, you know, Omaha. It'll be downtown Minneapolis. It'll be in cities, not only just Minneapolis, but urban areas where the possibility of civilians and innocent people being heavily engaged is very high. Global commons, for the first time in our history, has become a source of conflict. So, what's the global commons? Well, for example, who owns the oil at the bottom of the North Pole? Well, Russia just claimed it as theirs. Well, it's not theirs. But for the first time in history, what we used to think of as global commons, everybody owns this. No longer. That's a source of conflict. And you know, and we know, potential attacks. In fact, it's not even potential. We know there are attacks every single day. I got a report that was sent to the director of the National Intelligence Agencies that said, in just taking the computer system used by Congress in the month of March, 1.6 billion attacks in the month of March on that system alone. So we know that there are attacks not only from space, outer space, cybersecurity, but I didn't know this, but people are attempting virtually every day in our country to release, smallpox viruses and pandemics. Because if you can create chaos, you can bring down this country pretty fast. Media, education systems, I was not aware of a lot of these kinds of things. Values disillusion. Now the trouble is there's no strategies or no rules of engagement for these kinds of attacks. We know how to, Army doctrine is pretty well crafted. The Army War College is pretty, they're very good at what they do. The trouble is nobody gets this kind of training. Plus, 50% of the world will be connected. That's an amazing concept. So that social and web-based connectivity is going to be ubiquitous. What that means is that nation states are becoming much less important than our non-nation states. Connectivity will create the dissolution, essentially, of boundaries. So the enemies of democracy, of the Western world, of freedom, are more likely to be non-nation states than nation states. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem is non-nation states have never signed a treaty. There's never been any agreement on the rules of war. So you can blow up elementary schools, and all you do is get more publicity. See, the rules of war, the Geneva Convention says you don't shoot people who aren't shooting at you. You don't blow up facilities filled with children, except non-nation states, with a few, glory in that sort of thing. So the idea of high civilian casualties, criminal gangs, weapons of mass destruction, water pollution, media attacks, and so on, are all being espoused as the part of the future. Not only that, but we sort of know this. Whereas the economists have announced that the recession is over, the data suggests that we're still not in great shape. So this is just adjusted for population. This is what's happening with regard to unemployment. Okay. If I were to ask you, how many of you, if you were to estimate 10 years from now, and you had a 1 to 7 scale, we're going to be much worse off in 10 years or much better off, how many pick 1? How many pick 2? 3? 4? 5? 6? 7? Wow, we got a pretty normal curve. I might predict. Well, there are a lot of folks who are optimists, a lot of people who are pessimists, a lot of people in the middle. But we know that troubled times are just now a constant. We're not finished with those. So POS, among other things, is a way to think about it. It's a lens. It's a lot of other things as well. But in fact, we've just finished. I just finished. Did you get it? I just sent you a chapter. The introduction to the handbook. I'm trying to define what POS is in that chapter. But anyway, one of the definitions of POS is a lens, a positive lens. And so let me tell you what that means in terms of positive perspective. I'll just illustrate it. So this is a real picture of a real event. Happened in a place called Hurricane, Utah. So, a pickup truck's traveling at 75 miles an hour from right to left. When it crashed through the guardrail, you see that right there? Flipped end over end, bounced off and across the culvert outlet, landed right side up on the left side of the culvert, facing in the opposite direction. The 22-year-old driver's 18-year-old companion were unhurt. Now you'd say, holy cow, I mean, 75 miles an hour, that's a pretty big deal. You don't really realize how big a deal until you see that perspective. The whole point is perspective matters. So you think about being positive or the positive perspective as a perspective, it actually matters. We change the way we think and behave with perspective. There are a couple of other examples. I just got this the other day from somebody who's an Army, he's actually in charge of Army military intelligence. He's a really interesting guy. He put me onto this. It happens to be, this is an excerpt. I'm going to read this with you. So Rhonda Coram, who was a major and a flight surgeon in the 229th Attack Helicopter Regiment during the Gulf War, boarded a search and rescue flight on February 27, 1991. This is an excerpt from a St. Louis newspaper. She was looking for a pilot of a downed F-16 fighter in Iraq near Basra. Her Black Hawk was shot down. 5 of the 8 crew members were killed. Coram and 2 others were taken prisoner by the Iraqi army. Quote, let me tell you something about my own experience, she said. So I got shot down. The next thing I know, some Iraqi soldier was dislocating the shoulder in my already broken arm. I thought, well, I'm not dead. I'm a prisoner of war. That kind of thing can result in fear, anger, depression, or grief. But I thought, well, I'm not dead. As we were crashing, I remember thinking I had 2 options. Either I'd be dead or I'd be captured. Being captured was better. I could still wiggle my fingers, and that was good because I knew we were really good at doing orthopedics. Then this guy put a gun to my back of my head, and I was thinking, this is not really going well, is it? So I decided to think of something positive, and I was really racking my brain trying to come up with something. I thought, well, I've had a chance to have a really great life, had a great husband and a great kid. I've had a chance to do a lot of really great things, and at least it won't hurt, which is a better end than a lot of people get. Then I heard the gun go click and thought, well, this isn't that bad. Naturally, this is the same way I would have, and then the author of the article said, naturally, this is the same way I would have reacted under similar conditions, except for the part where I've been sobbing and cursing God and offering my captors Madonna's home telephone number. Then back to Rhonda. So this is still him. So what if you're not a highly motivated, highly accomplished, incredibly positive person like Rhonda Coram, 55, who's been a steeplechase rider, who wears airborne and air assault tabs on her uniform, who's not only had a doctorate in biochemistry but also a medical degree and specialties in surgery and urology, who has run the Army's Landstuhl hospital in Germany, who has written a best-selling book and dismissed her sexual assault by her Iraqi captors as not the biggest deal in my life. What then? She says these things are teachable. She happens to be running now the program for the Army where you're training new soldiers how to cope with stress. And boy, she lives perspective. She lives, well, let's see, I got to figure out something positive about the fact that there's a gun in the back of my head. Well, at least it won't hurt. Then my other friend, who's actually going to be here, is on campus for the next 2 or 3 days. He's the CEO of Prudential Real Estate and Retirement Company, Jim Malazzi, who, as the CEO of this company, one of his customers is BP, the oil company. So he was flying from California to Florida, and as they flew across, this is a couple of months ago, as they flew across the Gulf of Mexico, the pilot came on and he said, look down, you can see the oil spill. He said the plane got very quiet because of the tremendous devastation that they could see, miles of this oil slick on the Gulf of Mexico. He said, man, it was really sobering. He landed in Florida, picked up the phone, called the CEO of BP. He said, I know that this is going to be very difficult for you. I know that you're going to have to ship a lot of people from Great Britain to the U.S. Lots of equipment, lots of folks. And so we're going to give you free services until the job's done, because we want to help you do it right. Now, everybody else is putting their boot on the neck of BP, trying to crucify this company. What a terrible organization. This guy says, it's going to be tough. We want to help. Free of charge. We relocate everybody. Difference in perspective. Different way we think about what's our job. What do we do in our organization? And some other things. I'm not going to talk about that. Okay, so the whole notion is POS, among other things, helps us do different things because of the difference in perspective that we have. Okay, well, POS is not very controversial if you talk about the O, namely the organization or the context, what happens in organizations. Not very controversial when you talk about the S, scholarly, theoretically based, empirical foundation for any kind of prescriptions. That's the difference between POS and the self-help books. You know, I won't give examples, but we all know the sort of truisms may or may not be accurate in the self-help literature. POS says if you can't verify it, if there's not empirical foundation, if there's not a theory to explain why, then don't say it. The biggest problem is the P, positive. There have been a variety of authors who have really taken offense at the fact that we claim the P is relevant. So, for example, I finished reading a little while ago a book called Bright-Sided, How Positive Thinking is Destroying America. And Barbara is serious about this. And so not only her, but some other critics in the scholarly literature these are all quotations, who have said, look, if you take a positive perspective, it has a very restrictive connotation. There's a values bias. It's very ethnocentric and Western. It's a perpetuation of a narrow moral agenda. It ignores negative phenomena. It's an elitist viewpoint, only focused on the power elite, those in charge, managers. Mitigates against hard work. If it's positive, everybody wins. You know, everybody gets a blue ribbon. Nobody works very hard. Invites unpreparedness. Avoids difficult questions, denies reality, implies boastfulness and pride, assumes all success is deserved, leads to reckless optimism, produces delusional thinking. Not only that, but there's no evidence that this makes a difference. That's all in print. Well, what I want to suggest is that there's a lot of evidence that POS makes a difference. And what I decided to do on Saturday was to just survey some of that as sort of the introductory presentation in this series of things that Bob's organized for us. What I want to suggest is that if you take a positive perspective or focus on positive practices, something occurs called the heliotropic effect. Now, you know what the heliotropic effect is. You put a plant in the window over time and leans toward the light, which is an example of the heliotropic effect. Or in other words, the heliotropic effect is best defined as the following. All living systems, everything alive, has a tendency toward light and away from dark, or toward positive energy and away from negative energy, or most accurately stated, toward that which is life-giving and away from that which is life-depleting, which makes sense, right? In evolutionary theory, over time, species are attracted to that which gives life. In nature, it's normally the sun. And they are repelled by that which detracts from or endangers life. Now, there's a whole lot of evidence that suggests that's true. I want to spend 2 seconds on this or so. Positive information, people's minds, their brains, I'm going to show you in just a minute. People's minds or brains operate more accurately and more efficiently in a positive state than a negative state when exposed to positive information as opposed to negative information, when trying to learn positive phenomena as opposed to negative phenomena. In most languages, positive words are primal. You don't have to put an adjective in front of a positive word. You normally have to put an adjective in front of a negative word. Positive words generally enter languages. In the English language, on the average, positive words entered the English language 150 years before negative words, and so on. And we know learning theory that, by and large, you learn what's positively enforced. We tend to like people who are positive and not like people who aren't, and so on. I mean, there's a whole bunch of just very practical things, but there's some other things that are I think, even more interesting. So many of you know these studies. They're not my studies, but they're all published studies. So the studies are often done. I mean, one variation on these studies is our colleague Bob Emmons, who's at the University of California at Davis, who, with his students in his class, did the following experiments. So he would say to his students, okay, all of you this semester are required to keep a journal. But you are going to keep a journal every day, writing down 3 things for which you're grateful. Just write them down. I want you to keep track every day in your journal of 3 things for which you're not grateful, or even 3 neutral events. Just write them down. A variation on that is keep track of the 3 best things that happened to you today. You keep track of the 3 worst things that happened to you today. Okay, then 3 months later, semester later, a bunch of studies have been done, and here are the studies. Each of these down here are the studies. So one study, for example, is you give people a flu shot. After 1 week, literally 7 days, these people are healthier. You can detect more antibodies in the systems of these folks than these folks. Now you think about this. This is not having you lose weight. This is not having you train for a marathon. This is not changing your lifestyle. This is putting you in a gratitude condition once a day. And by the way, a bunch of other studies, variations on that, have simply put you in a virtuous condition. Compassionate, loving kindness, those kinds of things. Same thing happens. All right? Another study, genetic expression. Over time, there's more strength, more resiliency on this side than on this side. You give people what's called a mental acuity test, or in other words, how well can we help your brain function? So the way you do that is you give people a complex task to solve with lots of complex information, and you measure things like the quality of their decisions, how much information they process, how long they remember. Statistically significant differences. We can make you smarter over time than we can here, statistically speaking. All we're doing is putting you in a gratitude condition, virtuous condition once a day. I'll give you a creativity task. The normal creativity task is think of all the things you can use this pen for, or this bottle, or a brick. So what we would discover, statistically speaking, is a broader variety of ideas here and a larger number. It's called more mental flexibility than on this side. We can make your brain work differently. And down here, there's been studies done of what happens after loss of a spouse, either death or divorce. We can measure deep depression organically. That's why medication can treat deep depression. Well, we do the tests organically. We discover 0 deep depression after 6 months here, 30% deep depression here. And then you know about the nun study. 678 Catholic nuns living in a convent. It was an Alzheimer's disease study, studying women between the ages of 75 and 104, which was pretty clever because you can control for lots of factors. Medical care is the same, diet's the same, exercise the same, physical environment's the same. Okay, well, they found the journals or diaries of 180 of these women when they entered the convent 60 years before. Now, some of these women were saying things like this in their journal. This is the culmination of my life's dream. I'm so happy to enter the order. I'm so blessed. Some were saying this is going to be a real challenge, going to be really difficult, it's going to be a sacrifice, but I'm committed, I'm going to follow through. Difference? Then you simply counted the number of nuns alive in each group 60 years later of those 180. Now the numbers aren't precise, they're close, and they illustrate the difference. Of the 90 nuns in the first group, 70 are alive. Of the 90 nuns in the second group, 10 are alive. And at every decade there's a significant difference in mortality rates, not to mention morbidity or disease rates among these groups. Okay, the whole notion is a bunch of evidence that suggests in your body positive matters. Now let me show you in particular what I like a lot. We have a friend at Heart Math who Heart Math studies heart rhythms. It shows your heart rhythm when you're an appreciative and including a virtuous condition, meaning, for example, literally, well, there are lots of other virtuous states you can get yourself in, versus frustration. Now you know why after 60 years some people are alive and some people aren't. I mean, your heart works better. Not only that, but so does your brain. This is a study simply asking people to imagine a positive future versus a neutral or negative future. And what you notice is that there are more areas of your brain activated in the positive condition, and of those activated, they're activated to a greater extent compared to the negative. You're smarter. Your brain works better in a positive state. I mean, we can detect it. And I don't know why it's the case, but you can measure the rhythms in your body. Now, you have heart rhythm, of course, and you measure that on the basis of what they call hertz. It's sound. Well, you also have brain rhythms. You also have muscle twitch, muscle rhythms, and so on. Circulatory system. So rhythms are in your body. Okay, well, I don't know why it's the case, but when you are perfect, absolutely in harmony, or in other words, what they call coherent, that measure is 0.1 hertz. Okay, well, here is when you're angry. Here's a relaxation, or this is where the autonomic nervous system is taken over, when you're asleep. You are perfect when you are in a virtuous, in this case, a gratitude, appreciative condition. That is, you are at 0.1 hertz. You're not even when you're asleep are you as good as when you're in a positive state. I mean, there's a bunch of evidence that suggests this really matters. See, that makes a difference. This is a study by our colleague, used to be here, Barbara Fredrickson, and our colleague. Hasn't been published yet, but it's a study of the vagus nerve. Now, I didn't even know what the vagus nerve was, but it's a nerve that starts at the base of your brain and goes down your back, and it controls your heart, your lungs, your digestive system, the functioning of your kidneys, and stuff. You want vagus health, essentially your nervous system, to be highly functioning. Well, so you can induce people into a positive state. You do that in a lot of ways, and put people in front of a movie that makes you feel good versus one that makes you feel angry or depressed or something. So you can induce positive states. And what you then measure is well-being and vagus nerve health or coherence. And sure enough, we can make your vagus nerve rhythms better in a positive state. That's what this article is all about. So engendering positive emotions enhances vagal nerve functioning and, over time, more wellness and well-being. All right. Okay. Look, Cameron, you've just been spending a bunch of time with these Army generals and National Intelligence Agency leaders, and I mean, this is a little soupy for us. I mean, talking about gratitude in the state where we are at war, right? We're a condition of war. Not only that, but look, most organizations are fraught with problems. We do not need managers if there are no problems. Isn't that true? I'm with you. Positive people don't necessarily make for a positive organization. I mean, so your vagal health is fine. Yeah, great. But that doesn't help us make a great organization or a positive organization. So is there any evidence that organizations are better off? I mean, the P, okay, Cameron, I think we got some evidence that the P matters, but what about the O? So if we're all just happy, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have a great organization. We have a lot of happy people and you don't win any football games, right? This is our year. This week will be the test. So look, are the critics and detractors right? Is there any evidence to convince us that POS has any genuine, meaningful impact on organizations? That's the real question. That's the question that I've been worrying about for the last maybe decade or so, is trying to figure out, we got really pretty good evidence now about what happens to physiological functioning, social relationships, mental health, and all that kind of stuff. Okay. The problem is that the world works like this, for the most part. So there's evidence that most organizations don't pay much attention. And in fact, there's a little bit of an irony with regard to this work, because the irony is, on the one hand, things like gratitude or kindness or virtuousness of various kinds is inherently valuable. So if I am kind to Mitch only to get what I want, I'm only going to be kind to you if I get a payback. Well, it ceases by definition to be kindness, right? It's now manipulation. So virtuous, positive, doesn't need a payback because it's inherently valuable in and of itself. On the other hand, if I walk in the office of some CEO and say, I want to study in your organization, I want to have you make available to me your senior executives, and I need some time to have them fill out a questionnaire, I want to interview them, and I want to study compassion and forgiveness and kindness and integrity and humility. And I mean, he'd say, are you kidding me? Right? This is grandmother's advice. You show me how it pays off for us, and then maybe I'll invest. But otherwise, hey, look, get off my back. I got an analyst meeting in 15 minutes, right? So the irony is, I don't need a payback, but if I don't get one, I will get nobody to pay attention. So my own work has been, okay, well, wait a minute. We don't need a payback, but is there one nevertheless? Is there any evidence that organizations actually are better off if they pay attention? Okay, I want to give you some evidence. I'm going to skip that one. Okay. So here's some stuff. And I'm going to go through these with you relatively quickly because I want to leave a little bit of time to interact and ask questions and share experiences and yeah buts and so on at the end. There are a bunch of studies. I'm going to go through some of them very quickly. I'll stop on 2 or 3 of them just to give you a sense of what's going on. But the conclusion that I've reached after 10 years, and I'm actually quite convinced that it's accurate, that is an abundance approach. That's what I refer to as sometimes if I'm talking to a group of executives and I use positive organization scholarship, that doesn't make much sense to them. So I often talk about abundance, or in other words, thinking about going from we're doing well, thank you very much, to we're becoming positively deviant. That's an abundance gap. So I sometimes talk about developing an abundance culture or an abundance approach. That's where the word comes from. Or implementing organization virtuousness has, in fact, I've now come to the conclusion, has significant impact on 6 outcomes in organizations plus another. The outcomes are profitability. You actually make more money. And in the not-profit sector, you get more revenues. I mean, we've done studies of YMCA and Salvation Army, you get more revenues. Productivity, quality, innovation, customer, client satisfaction or loyalty, and employee engagement, employee retention, employee satisfaction. And it has impact on families. That is, individuals in their own families. I'll show you that data in just a minute. Okay, I'm going to show you the evidence. So this is a study of 7 organizations in the same industry. All we did was measure, in this case, I think it was 5 or 6 different virtuous practices and the 6 outcomes. And there's not causal association here at all. It's just panel data. But there's sort of a suggestion that there's a relationship between these 2 things, outcomes and the virtuous practices. This is a study of, we say, well, okay, let's see whether or not we can expand that sample. So this study, we picked organizations, all of whom are downsizing or had recently downsized. Now, the reason for that is that downsizing, during the mid 80s to about the late 90s, I was doing research on downsizing. The overwhelming finding in that research, there are several important findings, but one of them was, if you downsize, you will deteriorate in performance. 8 out of 10 times an organization will slide in its performance. Productivity will go down, profitability will go down, morale will go down, conflict will increase. Something we refer to as the dirty dozen. 12 negative dysfunctional things occur. For example, I'll give you 2 or 3 of those examples. So one, for example, is communication channels get restricted. People hold their cards close to the vest. They only pass good news upward. You be very careful about what you share when resources are tight. So communication, in fact, is restricted. It's worse. Something we've referred to as leadership anemia occurs. Not only do the best people leave, because they're marketable, but people scapegoat the leader. They lose credibility. I mean, if the Tigers lose, it's got to be Leland's fault, right? It's not that the shortstop can't hit or you made an error in center field. So you always scapegoat the leader. That means anemia occurs. When you really need leadership, that's the least likely time to get it. Conflict goes up. You have one cookie and two children, well, you're going to have tension. Same thing when you have few resources in organizations. The threat rigidity response occurs. You know, all that stuff. Okay, a dozen of those. Well, that predicts deteriorating performance. So we said, okay, if organizations are most likely to deteriorate, and we can find some of them that will actually be willing to have us study them, and we can measure positive practices or virtuous practices, then let's see what happens to them. Because most of them are not going to do well. Well, as it turns out, there's a big statistically significant relationship between objective factors, like how much money do they make, do they actually flourish after, as opposed to deteriorate after downsizing, and what happens to subjective factors like morale and turnover and, you know, subjective kinds of well-being. And bingo, not causal, just suggestive. Okay, another study, two organizations deteriorating, struggling, having a hard time, saying, come help us change, help us implement an abundance culture. And we've got a whole bunch of, I think probably something like 20 tools or intervention techniques that we help organizations implement. And bingo, performance comes back. You can't prove it's causal, can't prove the intervention did it. Just another suggestion that, sounds like there's a relationship. This is a study of the U.S. airline industry after 9/11. Now, you know what happened when the trade towers came down and the hole got blown in the Pentagon? For the next, 2 or 3 days, it was actually against the law to fly. We were not allowed to get on an airplane. When ridership returned, when people started to fly again, ridership topped out at 80% of previous ridership levels. And literally it was 80% until 2006. That was fine, except that the economic model of the U.S. airline industry was based on 86% seat fill rate in 2001. So you top out at 80%, you're going to lose money. And so 7 firms declared bankruptcy. Well, if you're not making enough money to survive, you certainly declare bankruptcy, but what's the strategy? Well, the obvious strategy was consolidate, cut budget. Everybody's got 20% too many planes, too many gate agents, too many pilots, too many mechanics. So they said downsizing is a necessity. We have to do that. Well, there's a story to tell about each one of these 10 airline companies, but the 2 companies I want to talk to you about were the short-haul carriers. Now, the short-haul carriers were getting hurt worse than the industry average. I don't know if you remember, but people were saying back then, I think maybe I'll just drive to Chicago. I don't think I'll take that plane. Or I think I'll take the train from Washington to New York rather than the shuttle. You remember that? Well, U.S. Airways has an average flight of less than 500 miles. Southwest Airlines has an average flight of less than 400 miles. Those are the 2 short-haul carriers, mainly dependent on short routes. Now, there are 2 things about this. One is, when people stop flying short-haul routes, you're hurt worse than the industry average. Second is, you can make a lot more money flying from Detroit to Tokyo than Detroit to Chicago. So you're very vulnerable. I mean, the margins are thinner for these companies anyway. Well, these 2 firms, and I'll just tell you about these 2 as opposed to many others. These 2 firms approached downsizing in very different ways. U.S. Airways declared what they call financial exigency. Now, what that means is you can declare financial exigency and all contracts are null and void. So they could now ignore union contracts, all the relationships with everybody who was an employee, and simply say, thank you very much for 20 years of service, Fritz. You're out of here. No benefits, hand in your keys, no health insurance, your pension's gone, but thanks for 20 years. I mean, holy cow. And the argument was, we just don't have enough money to pay. Southwest Airlines, on the other hand, said, we will not lay off anyone. Now, wait a minute. You're getting hurt worse than the industry average. You got 20% plus, too many of everything. Why in the world wouldn't you lay off people? And here's what the CEO said. He said, look, we're losing a lot of money every day. And clearly, we can't continue to do this indefinitely, he says, but we're willing to suffer some damage even to our stock price to protect the jobs of our people. That's kind of virtuous, isn't it? Now, why would you do that? Down here, you want to show your people that you value them. You're not going to hurt them just to get a little more money in the short term. Not furloughing people breeds loyalty, breeds a sense of security, breeds a sense of trust. Now, there are two things. One is people say, well, it's easy to explain, Cameron. They hedged fuel prices. I actually sat with the CEO and had lunch. And he said, everybody hedges fuel prices. You can't, fuel goes up and down every day, right? You can't change the price of an airline ticket every day. So everybody hedges. They hedge, we hedge. We hedge. In other words, we lock in a fuel price for the next year or some amount of time. You just hope it doesn't go down and you're paying too much. Some people say, well, they had a lot of cash on hand. Exactly, they had a lot of cash on hand. They were constantly being pressured by Wall Street, invest, take on debt, add more new planes, don't keep cash in a bank. No business wants to keep cash in a bank, right? Doesn't do any good. Especially the analysts saying, wait a minute, if you're going to have cash in a bank, then give it to us in terms of some kind of shareholder return. Southwest said we keep cash in a bank in case we have to invest in our people. This is a very consistent company. Now, the problem is Wall Street doesn't care about this. They don't care if you got cash in a bank. They don't care if you lay off people. They don't care if you treat them nice or not. I just want a return on my investment. This is a publicly traded company. It's among the most unionized companies in the airline industry. And so by and large, the Wall Street, the investors are saying, hey, show me the money. All right, well, here, as it turns out, is the money. This is just the first year. The correlation between the virtuousness of the downsizing strategy of these 10 firms and financial return is 0.86. Now, you have never seen a correlation at 0.86 in anything that matters in an organization, I would bet. That's an enormously positive correlation. In the article we published, we followed the data through 2006, and the correlation declines to 0.79. But, holy cow, money follows virtuousness. It's not causal, but it's hard to argue that it's the reverse, right? So, much more evidence is starting to pile up now. Okay. We picked financial services. We said, all right, if this is such an awful industry, and they don't care crank about anything except money, so let's study them. So we got 40 organizations in the financial services industry to say, we will try to have you measure us, and we'll actually, some of them, we're going to try to implement some positive practices. And so we measured them year one, year two, 0 point, year one, and year two. So we had change scores. In other words, now we're starting to get a sense of where's the causal direction going. As it turns out, if you can change positive practices, even in financial services, these amoral, show me the money folks. The least moral place on the planet is Wall Street, right? May not be immoral, but maybe immoral too, but certainly amoral. Who cares about values? As it turns out, changing positive practices gets you an R-square. That's a statistic that accounts for the amount of variance in outcomes. We measured 6 financial service outcomes. And these are, do people take their money out of Fidelity and give it to Prudential? Lost customers. Or how much cash do you have? Cash flow, expenses, stuff like that. Bingo. Positive practices predict financial performance. with an enormous relationship. And it's not only just the financial stuff, it's other things too. So these are just simply high scores in positive practices, and things like voluntary turnover and employee engagement and customer retention, keeping people that you want to keep. And then top management evaluations of how, we just asked the top management of these organizations how well they do, and we could predict. Positive practices are a better predictor of that evaluation than is profit. So as it turns out, they didn't know it, but the managers are actually evaluating more on the basis of how well they're doing positively. All right, this is a study of, I can't remember the number, 30 or something like that. I think it's 30 organizations in healthcare. And again, we were trying to look at what happens over time. So over a 2-year period of time, we can predict, or we can account for, a 26% improvement in patient satisfaction in organizations that improve in their positive practices. So you implement virtuous practices, patients like it. And not only do patients like it, but employees like it. So this is the willingness to recommend the place as a place you either ought to go get treated, or I'd recommend this as a place to work to my family and friends. I mean, one of the worst things, it's hard to see these numbers, but one of the worst things about healthcare organizations is that nurses always feel abused. They don't feel like they can do what they've been trained to do. Doctors always have prestige and don't treat other people very well, and so on. Well, we can improve that by 12% over a 2-year period of time with virtuous practices. You sort of might expect that, but pretty compelling data. All right. Are you getting tired of the data? What I'm trying to do, my motive is I want to pile it on to the point where not only you, but people in general, including the critics, say, okay, I think you got evidence. I think there's starting to be something that we ought to say, this matters. This one is measuring the positive energy of the unit leader in a big national firm, very little global business, but certainly national. That is, we measured, I won't show you the items, we simply measured the extent to which the leader is a positive energizer. 5 items. So Fritz is a positive energizer, he's life-giving, he's elevating, he helps me feel supported, uplifted, as opposed to a de-energizer, exhausts, pulls all our energy out of me. Geez, it's tough to deal with this guy. You know, those kind of people. Okay. Well, as it turns out, this is impact on individuals. So big impact, as you might expect, on job satisfaction. Big impact on the extent to which they're saying, I feel happy, supported, subjective well-being. Engaged in work, find purpose, meaning, and I'm willing to spend energy and effort. Performance as rated by the performance indicators. Here's the interesting thing. We had measures of the extent to which families were feeling enriched, supported, and successful. The positive energy of the leader of the organization impacts families. Now, for a lot of reasons, we could deconstruct that, and it wouldn't be hard to figure out. But it has extra organization impact as well as organization impact. And then here's just the organization. These are all business units, or in some cases, we'll call them business units. So it's not the overall organization, but you know, the cohesion, teamwork, that kind of stuff, experimentation, oops, I got to fix that, and innovation going on, team learning, and simply the performance indicators, both objective and subjective. You know, it happened again. I mean, positive practices matter. Not only that, but positive energy, which is one of the variables that has sort of emerged in this POS research as being a pretty critical variable. The idea that energy actually does predict. We all sort of know energy exists, but we don't manage it very well. I mean, can you think of anybody that ever got promoted or given an A because they were a positive energizer? And yet, it matters in organizations. Okay. Here's another, well, those are, this is another healthcare study, 4 different studies, blah, da, 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 da. Okay. One last thing, and I'm going to quit talking, and then we're going to talk together. So many of you know the story, but I want to tell it to you anyway. This is a place 16 miles west of Denver, Colorado. It's called the Rocky Flats Nuclear Arsenal. So in 1951, the Soviet Union was stockpiling weapons. We had to stockpile weapons to keep the world safe for democracy. I mean, you don't want the balance of power to get out of whack very far. At least you don't want to get it out of whack very far if, on the other side, there are people who you assume are going to be aggressive and are going to use them to try to take over other territories. And Russia became the Soviet Union because they took over other territories. We said, well, stop it right there. We'll start stockpiling weapons. Okay. The trigger, the nuclear trigger, the thing that explodes in our nuclear weapons, had to be manufactured someplace. They created Rocky Flats to manufacture the triggers that went into all the nuclear weapons, or most of the nuclear weapons in the U.S. stockpile. Well, 358 acres here, it's a small city, surrounded by 6,000 acres of buffer area. So if you turned the camera that way, you'd see the Denver skyline. It's not very far away. In fact, here's Denver, here's Boulder, here's Golden, Colorado, Coors Brewery. Rocky Flats is right in the middle. The problem is, nobody knew for sure whether or not this place was polluting the ground, water, the soil, whether or not there were radioactive emissions going in the air, because the Atomic Energy Commission controlled the place, not the Environmental Protection Agency. EPA is monitoring things like that. Atomic Energy Commission didn't care at all. They just need to get these triggers produced. So if your daughter's waiting for the school bus in the morning down in Denver, the question is she breathing in particles, radioactivity? If you're drinking any Coors beer, you glow in the dark? I mean, what happens to you? Nobody knew. So as it turns out, in 1994, they did a special. You know the Ted Koppel Nightline show? They did a special. And the title of the special was The Most Dangerous Buildings in America, and it was an expose on Rocky Flats. I'd like to show you a little bit of that clip because it would just floor you. What they essentially said is this place is enormously dangerous. Well, what happened is whoops, I need to fix that. The EPA started suing in the federal courts to get jurisdiction over Rocky Flats. And they won partial jurisdiction in 1989. And they showed up in 1989 with the FBI. And they said, okay, step back from the equipment. You may not touch anything until you prove to us that you're not polluting. Now, think about this. That's called a hot shutdown. 10 minutes after hot shutdown, it's a lot more dangerous than 10 minutes before hot shutdown, because you're dealing with plutonium, enriched uranium, transuratic acid. You're dealing with the most dangerous materials known to humankind. This stuff is in process. I mean, think about an auto plant. You got stuff halfway painted and halfway not, and you have not only this acid stuff, but plutonium remains stable only in nitric acid. So you have all these things with nitric acid in them. You got nitric acid in pipes and tanks. You got plutonium just sitting around. I mean, nobody's allowed by law to touch anything. Okay, for 6 years, 1989 to 1995, nothing happened. They simply had to try to prove they weren't polluting or that there was no pollution in the groundwater. Now, the problem is that if you're an expert in producing nuclear weapons, what do you know about taking soil samples? So it was just awful. Literally this is the truth, half of the place was going crazy trying to figure out a way to do soil samples and testing the air and so on. The other half was literally showing up, playing basketball, playing cards, watching TV for 6 years. See, the contract ended in 1995. So you're not going to cancel a contract. You've got to keep security guards out there and whatnot. You don't want terrorists to get a hold of anything on this place. You've got to keep it very secure. But you got nothing to do. So after 6 years of doing nothing, it sounds like a kind of a nice thing, doesn't it? But pretty soon, people are like, man, I don't like this at all. I got to have the paycheck. but I would like to be productive. So what happens is, you got 21 tons of nuclear grade material. Now, take this bottle. If that's plutonium, it would easily blow up Ann Arbor. It doesn't take much. Just make it a big lake. You got 21 tons on site. There's enough plutonium on site to blow up the world multiple times. There's 100 tons of it that's in solutions. That's nitric acid in tanks, barrels, pipes. Some of them leaking. I mean, after 6 years, nitric acid starts eating through stuff, you know. And so on. 11 rooms called infinity rooms. And infinity rooms because they were going to be polluted forever. The half-life of plutonium is 26,000 years. It's not going anywhere. So you can't just walk away. And not only did that happen, but literally the Denver Post wrote an article called it infinity rooms because you put a metering device in the room, it goes beyond infinity on the metering device. Now, somebody in the National Intelligence Agency said, wait a minute, all you have to do is recalibrate the device. That's true, he could have done that, but... So nobody liked it. Can you imagine living next door in Bloomfield or Arvada or Boulder, you know? People assumed they were going to work there forever and so on. 900 grievances, nobody liked it. People used to be patriotic heroes, now they're criminals, and at least accused environmental criminals. Okay. Well, it costs $700 million a year to keep the fans running, keep security guards out there. You can't continue to do that forever. I mean, 6 years times $700 million, you know, that's $4.2 billion, which doesn't sound a lot anymore, does it? I mean, I'd do it for half that, you know. It's a lot of money. So finally, end of the contract, 1995. And by the way, George Herbert Walker Bush, the president, said in 1992, we're not going to restart this at all. Cold War's over. We're not going to produce nuclear triggers. Okay. Nobody has ever in the history of the world cleaned up a nuclear arsenal. There are no procedures. So they brought together a blue ribbon commission, they meaning the Department of Energy, and said, okay, give us an estimate of how long it's going to take to clean this up and how much it'll cost. And by the way, we got a bunch of other sites in America, a dozen or so. So give us an estimate for those too. The number for Rocky Flats was 70 years and $36 billion. Now, I interviewed the Secretary of Energy who said that was a gross underestimate. We assumed it would take 200 years. But you can't send in an RFP for 200 years. I mean, so we picked a lifetime. Okay, here's what they did. These are glove boxes. This guy's handling plutonium. This is nitric acid in here. So you have glove boxes where you put your hands in, and that's how you manipulate this stuff so you don't get exposed to radioactivity. There are 1,600 glove boxes. And when you want to repair those or clean them during the process over the past 40 years, it takes 1 year on the average to clean a glove box. Times 1,600, now you know why, holy cow, it's going to take us a long time. Plus, this, this shows you where the stuff was stored. Now, it's stored all over the place, but these are barrels containing nitric acid and plutonium on wooden pallets, and that's fine, except the plutonium was designed to be recycled back into the production system on a yearly basis. This picture is taken at the 5-year mark. I mean, how long do you want that stuff to sit there? Some of it you got to go find. They didn't even know where it all was. Plutonium residues that are in everything. If this was one of those buildings, we would have to clean this pen. You don't want your children taking this home if it's radioactive. So it's in the concrete, it's in the walls, it's in the ductwork, it's in the light fixtures, it's in everything. You got to clean every square inch of 800 buildings. And security was so tight. This shows you the guy, if you walked on site, you'd be escorted by a guy with live ammunition and an M16 weapon, and you can see they're just storing stuff in the hallways. And over here, you can't really tell, but you got 3 levels of razor wire. This is more secure than a maximum security prison. And here's how people thought about this. I've had several people from the University of Colorado said, oh yeah, I became a social activist when we used to go down and protest at Rocky Flats on a weekly basis. They'd lie across the road to keep trucks from going in and out or chain themselves to the front gate, stuff like that. Okay. So why do I tell you about Rocky Flats and who cares? Here's why. They finished, the company that got the contract in 1995, competitively won the contract, they finished 60 years early. $30 billion under budget. Who do you know has ever come under budget by $30 billion? 13 times cleaner than required by federal standards. You know, anybody who's ever beat the federal standard by a factor of 13. It's cleaner now than it was when they started in 1951. And adversaries, protesters, antagonists became advocates and lobbyists. I mean, how do you do that? Unions, which by definition are in business to preserve jobs, were enthusiastically working themselves out of a job as fast as they could. The whole point of that is this was an enormously, positively deviant performance. Now, why do I tell you the story? This is how Rocky Flats looked in 2005 when they finished. You can't tell there's nothing there. It's a wildlife refuge. They brought in buffalo and antelope and Boy Scout camps and stuff can go out there. They'll never build homes out there, but they could. Okay, the whole point of this story is they woke up every morning. They changed the federal contract. They interacted with external constituencies, all on the basis of an abundance approach, a POS approach. They lived it, they breathed it, they talked it, the language. And all we did is capture what they were saying as they were doing it. The study started in 2002 and didn't end until 2005, and so we were simply capturing what they were doing as they were going. And it is an exact example of what happens when you implement positive practices. Bingo, you get enormously positive results. So tough to argue that the causal relationship goes the other way here, you know. Okay, the point of all this is abundant evidence, in my view, this is the conclusion, suggests that organizations that implement virtuous practices, even in troubled times, Rocky Flats is not soupy and syrupy. It's not just smile and everything is fine. POS is not just be happy and all will fall into place. Not true. It's very difficult to do. But you get 6 outcomes and, interestingly, some impact on things outside of work. The conclusion is positivity pays off for organizations as well as for individuals. I'm pretty convinced that that's the case. So I think we've got something that is adding a contribution. I think POS deserves to be around, you know. Now, what are the buts? What are the questions? We've got a few minutes. I wanted to leave a few minutes to have you respond or ask, or you don't have to ask. I don't have to be an expert having answers, but some of you have experiences, and some people are spectacular experts at making this work. Mary has become a heroine in this institution by having, 75 different sessions where she's trying to implement this stuff at the University of Michigan with the staff. Isn't that true? Spectacular. Good question. The question is, how does this compare with appreciative inquiry? Appreciative inquiry was originated in David Cooper Ryder's dissertation with his mentors, Suresh Shrivastava, who died a couple of years ago, down at Case Western. Case is a really good place for organization development, OD. And Dave and others down there as well began saying, you know what, most OD is, it's sort of a SWOT analysis. You think about strengths, weaknesses, and so on. But truly, strengths gets ignored, opportunities gets ignored. Everybody talks about threats and weaknesses. So appreciative inquiry was, look, if we can inquire, ask questions about appreciative or positive things, we will capture something he refers to as the positive core of the organization. So it is a wonderful tool to try to, at least for sort of the first steps or two of planned change interventions. The practice has far outstripped the research. There's very little research that says appreciative inquiry works or why it works and so on. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and David does spectacular stuff. I mean, he's intervened the United Nations, created the United, or at least helped create the United Religions Initiative. There have been all kinds of things. I put appreciative inquiry as one of the tools underneath this big umbrella called POS. So there's POS, there's also best self-feedback, there's also a variety of interventions. There are some of them on our website and so on, but there's a whole bunch of tools. Appreciative inquiry is one really good one. But once you design and so on, get to the destiny part. Once you got the destiny, then, I mean, we've now planned and so on, then we're sort of stopped with appreciative inquiry. Now you got to do implementation of various kinds. So I think it's and we're great friends. We love each other, Case and here and David. But they would agree, I think, as well, that it comes under this umbrella of a whole bunch of positive dynamics and positive practices. Very effective tool. And David, if you haven't read David Cooperrider, Cooperrider, he's worth reading. Thank you. Are we done? Please, Mitch.
I'm interested in, you said earlier that if you have a bunch of positive individuals in an organization, it doesn't necessarily create a positive organization. So what is that difference and how do you create positive cultures versus bringing positive people in?
Yeah, good question. The question is, okay, if you said, Cameron, that we don't have that a bunch of positive individuals do not a positive organization make, well, so how do you create a positive organization? That's a big topic. And creating a positive or abundance culture is a big topic. So the short answer is there are a bunch of tools, actually, that we've kind of listed. I could pull them up on this computer. Where we help organizations try to foster or enable or implement positive practices, or a bunch of positive practices. Everywhere from how do you compensate and evaluate people, how do you foster, enable, teach positive energy. I mean, positive energy is not a personality factor. It's just not gregariousness. It rather is a set of behaviors, which you can teach. So there are a bunch of interventions, is the whole point, that are on the organization level as opposed to the cognitive level that we help organizations. And some of these stories, I've told you, part of what you're trying to do when you do research on this stuff is to say, well, what is it they're doing that fosters this outcome? And so some of these studies and others of folks in the room highlight those. That's not a specific answer at all, but the resources are available is the point. Thanks.
I was struck by the fact that you said that people find positive a term that's difficult to deal with, and yet virtuous isn't.
Both.
And to me, it's
Yeah.
that,
Virtuous is awful.
CEO is saying, I want to measure your virtuous.
Yep.
Yeah.
Boy, yeah, it's true. Virtuousness or virtue has this really sort of religious or philosophical connotation. It's really hard to use that word in scholarly circles. Positive has this saccharine sweet, Pollyanna-ish notion. Virtuousness has this moral dogma, what are you trying to impose on me connotation. Virtuousness in the original Greek means the best of the human condition. The highest aspirations human beings have for themselves is virtuous state. So when you're at your best, you're in a virtuous state. So if you can get past that, then people are willing to talk about it. But that's why it's so difficult with practitioners. I mean, with people running organizations, you have to be very careful with the language. I think that's really an important point.
So in essence, when you're talking to somebody about this, you're saying, we're looking at virtuous practices in essence, what we're looking at are those practices that you are performing or doing or whatever when you're at your best.
Yes, that's a good way to talk about it. I more often talk about positive practices than virtuous practices, but I equate them. Yeah. Arthur? Okay. Lenny? Yeah.
Kim, we talk about corporate culture, and given my age, I've probably been head down in that too many times. My notion on that is that an organization's culture is made up of people from a range of beliefs and virtuousness and abundance and negativity and all that sort of thing. So am I saying this right by saying an organization that does hold a positive nature into its being is a mixture of some pretty high level and probably some very low level people in the culture who are influencing the culture to move
Can you hear? So is a positive culture a product of having high-level as well as low-level people helping the organization move in those directions? I'd say yes for sure, but I'd also say that routines and structures and strategies and a whole bunch of things like that are also crucial. Besides just saying we're going to make you guys really positive, see if you can affect the organization, there are other things as well, which you know about. Yeah. So changing culture is hard work, and it never is fast work. And there are some people who say you can't do it. I think we've seen it several times. Part of the message of the Rocky Flats story is they said we had to break our culture. And what that meant for them was we had to superimpose some challenges on the culture that the culture could not handle. So we broke it, and then we could create it.
Jim, let's do one more question.
Please, thanks, Bob. You're it.
Well, I feel in one sense, like a visitor from another planet. School,
Yeah.
20 years. So before POS got started, I was rooted in OT from a school that didn't so much focus on the weakness and threat part. And there's been this ambiguity when I've dealt with business and the purpose of business, which at times seems to be run as if it's not about that business is a part of human behavior, rather than humans are a part of what business needs. And I don't know where this hits, but keying off of what you were saying in response to Lanny, I have this wonderment about what we know works in the long run in the affairs of human beings. I look at thousands of years of history versus relatively short-term outcomes that tend to favor the more utilitarian people. Is any of this, not just in terms of mindset, but in terms of demonstrable workability, help change both, not just the outcomes, but the mindsets of people who are responsible for running large enterprises?
Yeah. I think that's, can you hear? Hard to hear. Janet doesn't care if you can hear or not. She's saying, would you please get off stage? So let's talk later. All right? Okay, I'm done. Listen, I know who the boss is.
Thank you, Kim. In addition to thanking Kim, we also have present two wonderful people in Paul and Diane Jones. If you two would just raise your hand, we'd like to.
Yeah, Paul and
Now, these are the two people who sponsored for the last several years Positive Links and make all these wonderful things possible for us. So we'd like to thank them as well. Okay, we'll see you, hopefully to have you come back in next month when Gretchen Spreitz will be speaking to us. So thanks very much. Bye-bye.